So today we're going to do a brief introduction into the start of the Cold War, the two major players in the Cold War, the US policies towards the Soviet Union, and their responses, and kind of some of the first initial incidents of the Cold War. So let us look at the end of World War II, we're kind of left with two major superpowers. All the European nations, Japan, they have all been devastated by the war, whether they won or lost. The fighting had been done on their soil. They were really unable to recover quickly. Financially devastated, they lost a whole generation of their men. So if we look at the loss of life, we look at the destruction of buildings and homes and businesses. Um, all of these countries are pretty devastated. Now, the United States, besides Hawaii, the war was not fought on our soil. So we had a slight advantage when it came to us versus the Soviet Union because it had been fought there and they had had enormous destruction because of it. So, Cold War was a state of intense economic, political, military, and ideological rivalry between these two nations. Now, it's called the Cold War, obviously, because it never heated up. It was cold, there was no physical fighting. There will be proxy wars, which are wars where we have two smaller nations fighting that are either financially or with aid, with people supported by the United States and the Soviet Union, and that will kind of heat up. The Vietnam War, Korean War, those are all examples. But we will never have the two nations actually fight against each other. So how are they different? Sorry, you can't see all this, you guys. If we look on one side, and a lot of this we already know, so we're just doing a refresher of the differences between the Soviet Union and the United States. Soviet Union ideologically is totally different, right? Communism is totally different from democracy. In communism, everything is owned by the collective. Is this ever 100% totally possible? No, but the main idea is there is no private property. Everything is shared. There is no political choice, right? You have your one leader. We have Stalin, right? And communism is also an atheistic political philosophy. So there is no God, which the United States is really going to take advantage of that to try and kind of sell people on the communism is bad thing. This is also when we add one nation under God into the Pledge of Allegiance to kind of be like, we have God, they do not. So kind of an interesting way to try and fight communism there. Communism, at least in the Soviet Union, was a totalitarian leadership rule where they had complete control. Like people had no say in where they lived and what they did and who ran their country and what they wanted to be when they grew up. And they truly believed that communism was going to take over the world because all of the workers all over the world would rise up against kind of their masters, right, to take control. So totally opposite side of that is the American system with private property, with elections. We'll have winners and losers, and things will change, and leaders will change. Political parties will change. We have religion. We also have freedom of religion, so you can practice or not practice whatever you choose. And we have capitalism, which is the means of production are privately owned versus in communism where the means of production are owned by the masses. So where do we start off after World War II? And actually, the Yalta Conference is going to happen before the end of World War II, where the three big leaders will get together. And if we look at that picture, we can see Winston Churchill there on the left. FDR, he's about to pass away in the middle there, so he's not looking too healthy, and Stalin looking grumpy on the far right. So what happens at the Yalta Conference? The three know that the war is coming to an end. And so they get together to decide, what is the world going to look like, right? What are we going to do? So the first thing they decide is, what are we going to do with Germany? Now, they don't come up with the actual plan, but what they decide is Germany will be divided into four parts to be controlled by Great Britain, the US, the Soviet Union, and France. So they will each get a piece. They will not be part of their country, but they will be in charge of it until an unforeseen time in the future. Big one here, the Soviet Union promises to join the war in the Pacific as soon as the war in Europe is over. Stalin says that he will shift all of his support to help the United States beat Japan in the Pacific. Now, the US does not want that because remember, Stalin won in Europe without any help. Remember that he wanted our help and we said no, we went with the British plan, right? And went in. So we need to win without him. So we really, really need to win the war in the Pacific before he has time to come and help us. The United Nations is created. Remember, we'd had that League of Nations. It really had no teeth. It couldn't really do anything. So the United Nations is going to be formed, and it's going to have a lot more power because people are going to see that it is beneficial, that it might have helped. And United Nations still around today, right? The last little piece here is the Soviet Union promises that all of these little nations created in Eastern Europe, kind of between mainland Europe and the Soviet Union, will get to have free elections and pick whether they want to be communist, whether they want to be democratic, and what they're going to do there. Remember, Poland had been totally taken over, right? And so now Poland is its own nation again. So they promise that they will let them do their own thing politically and figure out what they want to do. He's going to break that right away, just so you know. So that brings us to the United Nations. Now, a couple big points with the United Nations, founded in 1945, right at the Yalta Conference. They will get together representatives from all these nations, 44 nations to start, and they will come up with kind of a set of rules that will take them about a year. They're going to have a General Assembly, which is all the members together, but then they're also going to have this special council, a Security Council, and that will have 5 permanent members and then 1 member nation that will be voted in or that will switch every 2 years. So those 5 permanent members, of course, are the US, the UK, France, Soviet Union, and China. Now, the big thing with being on the council is you have veto power to anything. So if everyone comes together and they decide we all want to do this, but the Soviet Union says, we don't like that, they can veto it off the bat. One of the first things the United Nations also does is they create the Geneva Convention. I know you can't see this, but it's in your reading as well. And that is kind of a list of rules for the treatment of POWs during wartime. So even if you are a nation fighting against another nation, when you capture enemy combatants or non-military, when you get civilians as prisoners of war, how are you going to treat them? Because think of how the Japanese, right, treated those Americans in the Bataan Death March. Think of how the Chinese were treated by the Japanese. Hitler, how he treated the concentration camps. Like, so we come up with these rules, right? So that's the United Nations. So shortly after we have the Yalta Conference, we will come back together for the Potsdam Conference. This is going to look way different. I know I'm kind of blocking the picture, but you can see their heads at the top there. The only guy we still know there is Stalin, right? FDR has died. He's been replaced by Truman, his vice president. And that on the far left is actually Clement Attlee, who will replace Winston Churchill. A little bit of drama there. At the Potsdam Conference, Churchill was actually there and he starts the discussions. And British politics is a little different where the prime minister at any time can receive basically a vote of no confidence and they have a revote and they can either re-elect him or they can put someone else in. So while Churchill is at this conference, Parliament votes him out of office and replaces him with Clement Attlee. So that is him sitting there. So the big things here are, how are we going to deal with Germany and Japan? So the wars are all over, right? The last one, they were kind of coming to a close. This one, they are over. Excuse me. So a couple things have happened at this point. One, all of those elections happened or were supposed to happen in Eastern European countries, including Europe, but Stalin saw they weren't going to go his way. So he either rigged the elections or he totally canceled them and put in a communist leader. So already broke a promise there. Tensions are already starting. This is kind of the beginnings of the Cold War, right? Second, Germany, we officially decided that they're going to demilitarize Germany. It's going to be broken into those 4 spots. But we're also going to break Berlin up into 4 spots. Now, Berlin is the capital, right? So Berlin is going to be divided into 4 zones, just like the country. The only weird part here is that Berlin is actually in the Soviet-controlled area. So in the middle of the Soviet-controlled area is Berlin, which is going to have this little tiny, 3 of the 4 parts of Berlin are going to be held by democratic nations. So that's going to cause some drama moving forward here. So Shortly after this, now remember, Churchill's no longer prime minister, right? But he gives this very famous speech where he says that an iron curtain has fallen in Europe, separating the communist nations controlled by the Soviet Union from the democratic nations in the West. Now we can look at this map right here and see that white line drawn. The interesting part is if you look at the bottom in red, you'll see Yugoslavia. Now Yugoslavia was a communist nation, but it was not under the control of the Soviet Union. So it will not team up with the Soviet Union when we create the Warsaw Pact. It's kind of a communist nation in its own right. So the Iron Curtain will kind of be this term separating the East and the West for a really long time to come. So what is the United States going to do? What's going to be our policy against the Soviet Union? We also, during this time, are kind of having this nuclear race as well, which we're not going to talk about with here. But one of the reasons we never directly go to war with the Soviet Union is, remember that we have the bombs that we drop, right, at the end of World War II. Shortly after, the Soviet Union is also going to test their first bomb, and then we're just going to keep ramping up kind of this arms race of scarier and scarier weapons and more weapons. And so we never want to go to war with the Soviet Union because they always use this example of if we press the red button, that gives them just enough time to press their red button, and that would lead to mutually assured destruction, which will become MAD, this acronym for why we are never going to actually fight the Soviet Union. So this is George Kennan. He is over in Europe at the time. He sees what's happening in the Soviet Union. He's based in Moscow. He sees how they feel towards us, and he says, there's never going to be peace. Like, this is never going to work. So he offers up the idea of containment, the idea that we're not going to fight the Soviet Union or try and stop them, but we are going to try and contain them or stop them from spreading. So that's going to be the US policy going forward, is the idea that the Soviets are the Soviets, do your thing, but you can't spread it any further. Now Truman is going to take that a step further with the Truman Doctrine. Now, the thing about communism is if we look at the state of Europe after World War II, they're devastated. Their people are starving. They have no food because their fields have been destroyed. They have no jobs because their offices and their factories have been destroyed. And the idea of electing someone that can do nothing, and you have these rich people that are still rich and everyone else is poor. And so the idea of communism, where all of a sudden the government steps in and everyone, gets a loaf of bread and everyone gets a pair of shoes, and the government takes care of you that way as long as you do what they say, it doesn't sound that bad. At least you'd have a loaf of bread. So the United States says, what are we going to do to stop communism from spreading? We need to rebuild these European nations, and they need to be successful as democracies in order to say no to communism. So Truman asks Congress, because he can't do it on his own, for aid to build up these European nations. And the thing that triggers him to do this is in both Greece and Turkey, we see revolutions where communism starts to try and overtake the democratic leadership. Now, one of those is successful, one is not, but it freaks out Truman, which it rightly should. So he asked Congress for support, and they say, no, those are civil wars. We're not going to give money to nations that are in the middle of civil wars. But then the Soviets take over Czechoslovakia. So this is not a civil war. This is the Soviet Union reaching out and taking a nation, right? So that goes against, right, this whole policy of containment. So right away, Congress approves the Marshall Plan, named after the guy that created it, the Secretary of State, George Marshall. And they are going to give money to European nations to rebuild their factories, to start new industries, to give money to their people to survive. And over the length of this program, they will give over $12 billion to European nations. They offer it to any nation that is willing to follow a certain set of guidelines. One of those main guidelines is that when you get money, you will buy US products. So look, they're helping the US here too. All these nations accept it, except the Soviet Union. So we do actually offer money to the Soviet Union, and they reject it because they are unwilling to follow the rules set forward by the Marshall Plan. And it is very, very, very successful. If we look at, this is an amount of money, notice, we give the most money to our friends, obviously to France and Great Britain, but we give a lot of money to many, many nations. And these nations, if we look, besides Yugoslavia, they're all going to stay democracies and be very successful and be partners in this fight against the Soviet Union. Now, we're not going to talk about it specifically here, but we do another plan in Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, called the 4-Point Plan. And that is going to be how we help rebuild Japan, how we help rebuild Taiwan, South Korea, and that is what enables them to become the economic powerhouses they are today. We bring in our military to defend them. We give them money to rebuild their factories, and so they are able to just put everything into rebuilding their nation economically. So if we look at this here, this is a city in Germany, in Hamburg on the top. That's before, right? This is after the war. Now on the bottom, that is afterwards. So they have totally rebuilt their nation. So we're having the standoff, right? And all these little pieces. Now we're going to have lots and lots and lots of real battles, of scary situations between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the very first one is going to be the Berlin blockade. So remember when we were talking about how Berlin is also split into 4 pieces, but Berlin is situated inside of the Soviet zone? So what's going to happen is in 1948, you can see it here, the 3 nations that are democracies, so Great Britain, the United States, and France, decide they're going to unite their 3 sections into one democratic German nation, and they're going to use they're going to create their own money and their own financial system, and that it will be supported by these Western nations. And the Soviets are like, yeah, no, like that's not okay, you can't do that. And not that they can't do that, but what is happening is people on the Soviet side, when the Soviets took control of their section of Germany and their section of Berlin, instead of trying to rebuild it like the United States did with the Marshall Plan, they just stripped it of everything because they didn't want Germany to ever be a threat again. So they took all of their equipment, they took all of their military supplies, they emptied out their factories. So the Soviet-controlled German Democratic Republic was financially devastated. People were starving, life sucked, and so they are fleeing across the borders. And in Berlin, that was really easy because all you had to do was walk from the Soviet-controlled section of Berlin across the street to the US-controlled, or this new kind of Allied-controlled area. So in order to try and get the Allied-controlled section of Berlin to come under their control, they decide to blockade off all of Berlin so they can get no supplies. His plan is, by blocking off the railway, the roads, the canal, that they will be so desperate that they will end up succumbing to communism and Berlin will be united as a communist Berlin. So there's no way to get supplies into them. So what he decides to do, or I shouldn't say he, what we decide to do is we decide to airlift supplies into Berlin. And if you want to watch a great extra credit, that is not like I'm giving you extra credit, but extra credit is a YouTube channel. They have a 3-part series on the Berlin airlift and it's really, really good. But they have to drop enough supplies in to Berlin to sustain the people. And it takes them several days to manage to do it. They bring in a US leader to lead it. They are using French and British pilots, even German pilots, and they are able to do it. They are successful. So for nearly a year, they airlift supplies in. And this is a standoff, right? Because Truman says that if any plane is shot down, that is an act of war, and this would be a war with the Soviet Union. And Stalin really, really can't handle that. And so May of 1949, he lifts the blockade. And it's kind of this it's not a war, but the US kind of has this symbolic victory. Now, 10 years later, he is going to build the Berlin Wall. So that's going to be another kind of battle here. But at this point, the United States has just had a massive victory over the Soviet Union. Now, the Berlin airlift leads these nations that are kind of in this semi-war against the Soviet Union to say we should unite together and kind of have our own little club, and that is going to be NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We can see the darkest, it goes from darkest to lightest, most light. Those are going to be the earliest nations. How many other nations will join? NATO is still around today. We still are in a treaty with these other countries, and the Soviet Union is going to say, well, then we have to have our own, right? So they create the Warsaw Pact. Now, this was disbanded in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved, Some of these nations were forced to be a part of this. Some of these nations were coerced into being a part of this. But the crazy thing was that NATO said that they would financially help each other, right? They were all part of the Marshall Plan. The Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union has no money, so they can't help any of these nations. They just say, you have to be a part of our pact. Now, the one communist nation that does not join, Yugoslavia, right? They're kind of in their own role. So as we leave it here, we're about 1949. We're going to have NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, which is going to lead us into our first real kind of hot zone proxy war, which will be in Korea.